The smoke poured black and thick from the top floors of the old apartment building, turning the late afternoon sky into night. Sirens screamed closer, red lights flashing against the brick. Down on the street, a crowd had already gathered, phones rise at hearts pounding. Then he appeared, a firefighter in full gear, helmet low, moving against the tide of people running out. He carried a limp man over his shoulder like the weight was nothing. The injured stranger's face was covered in soot, one leg bent wrong, but the firefighter never slowed. He laid the man gently on the sidewalk, dropped to his knees, and started checking for breath. Across the street, parked in a hurry with the driver door still open, stood Alexander Grant, the wealthy CEO everyone in the city knew by name. He had been on his way to a board meeting when he saw the flames. Something made him stop. He stepped out in his perfect suit, tie fluttering in the hot wind, and watched the scene unfold. The firefighter tore off his gloves, pressed both hands to the stranger's chest, and began compressions, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The crowd was silent, except for a few muffled cries. Alexander felt his own chest tighten. He had built hospitals, funded research, written checks for millions, but he had never felt this helpless. The firefighter looked up for a second, sweat cutting clean lines through the black on his face. His eyes found Alexander's across the chaos. "Help me," the look said. Alexander didn't think. He crossed the street, knelt on the concrete beside them, not caring that his trousers would be ruined, and placed his shaking hands over the firefighters. Together they pushed life back into the stranger's body. The firefighter nodded once, grateful, and kept the rhythm. Alexander closed his eyes. "Lord, let him live," he whispered, voice cracking. "Please, let him live." Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, an ambulance screeched to the curb. Paramedics took over, lifting the stranger onto a stretcher. The firefighter sat back on his heels, chest heaving, staring at the man being wheeled away. Alexander stayed on his knees a moment longer, hands now covered in ash and someone else's blood. He didn't stand until the ambulance doors closed. When he did, the firefighter offered a tired hand. Alexander took it. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Something sacred had just happened between two men who, until 5 minutes ago, had never met. Do you want me to continue with the next part? The firefighter's name was Daniel Harper, 36 years old, 15 on the job, known at the station for never leaving anyone behind. The stranger he carried out that day was Michael Evans, a quiet night shift janitor who lived alone on the 4th floor. Daniel visited him every day in the burn unit, sitting by the bed while machines beeped and bandages hid most of Michael's face. He brought coffee he never drank himself and talked about anything except the fire. He told Michael about his little girl waiting at home, about the stray dog the crew had adopted, about how the sky looked the morning after a long shift. Michael couldn't answer yet, but Daniel believed he heard every word. Alexander Grant couldn't stay away either. He paid for private nurses, the best skin grafts, anything the hospital asked. Then he did something no one expected. Every evening after the markets closed, he drove to the hospital in the same soot-stained suit he refused to throw away and sat on the other side of Michael's bed. Sometimes, Daniel was already there. The two men would nod, share the silence, and watch the numbers on the monitor climb a little higher each day. One night, weeks later, Michael finally opened his eyes. The room was dim, only the glow from the hallway. Daniel had fallen asleep in the chair, head tipped back, still wearing his station tip. Alexander was reading the Bible app on his phone. Thumb paused mid. Michael's voice came out, dry and broken. "Water," he rasped. Both men moved at once. Daniel reached the pitcher first. Alexander held the straw steady. Michael drank, coughed, then looked from one to the other. "You saved me," he whispered. Daniel shook his head. "We all did." Later, when the nurses stepped out, Michael asked the question that had been burning in him since he woke. Why did two strangers fight so hard for someone they didn't know? Daniel glanced at Alexander, then back at Michael. "Because some of us know what it feels like to be left behind," he sighed softly. Alexander added nothing. He only looked down at his hands, the ones that had prayed on a sidewalk while sirens screamed. once, Pa said. Michael learned to walk again with a limp that would stay forever. The day he was discharged, Daniel pushed the wheelchair to the hospital doors. Alexander waited outside with a simple bouquet of sunflowers. No card, no cameras. Michael stood slowly, hugged Daniel so tight the firefighter had to steady himself, then turned to Alexander. The CEO, who once commanded boardrooms, now looked almost shy. Michael reached out and took Alexander's hand in both of his bandaged ones. "I heard you praying for me that day," Michael said. Alexander's eyes filled. "I hadn't prayed in 20 years, he answered, voice thick. "You gave me a reason to start again." Life moved forward, but the three men stayed woven together. Daniel invited Michael to the fire station barbecue. The crew greeted him like a brother, slapping his back too hard, pressing plates of food into his hands. Alexander showed up late, still in his suit, carrying cases of soda because he didn't know what else to bring. The firefighters teased him gently, called him Suit, and within an hour he was laughing louder than any of them. Face smeared with barbecue sauce, tie tucked into his shirt. One quiet Sunday, Alexander asked both men to meet him at the rebuilt apartment building. The place gleamed with new brick and fresh paint. He led them to the 4th floor, to the apartment that used to be Michael's. When he opened the door, the rooms were fully furnished, simple but warm. Photographs of Michael's late wife on the walls, because Alexander had tracked them down. Michael stood frozen in the doorway. Daniel put a steady hand on his shoulder. Alexander spoke softly. "This is yours. No rent, no strings. You came back to us once. We want you to stay." Michael walked to the window, looked out at the city that almost took him, and began to cry without sound. Daniel and Alexander stood behind him, saying nothing, letting the moment be. After a long while, Michael turned. "I spent my whole life cleaning other people's floors," he said. "I never thought anyone would ever build one for me." He looked at Daniel, then at Alexander. "Thank you for carrying me out, and thank you for carrying me home." That evening, the three of them sat on the new couch, sharing pizza straight from the box, talking until the stars came out. They were no longer firefighter, CEO, and janitor. They were brothers, bound by smoke and prayer, and a miracle none of them could explain. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world. A year later, on a crisp autumn evening, the three men stood together again at the fire station's annual memorial wall. Names of the fallen were etched in polished granite, catching the last light of the day. Daniel rested a hand on the stone, tracing a name he knew by heart, his first captain. Lost in a warehouse blaze when Daniel was still a rookie, Michael stood beside him with a slight lean on his cane, sunflowers in his free hand, the same kind Alexander had brought to the hospital. Alexander, no longer wearing a tie even to board meetings, stood quietly on Michael's other side. The captain called for a moment of silence. Hundreds of firefighters, families, and friends bowed their heads. In that stillness, Daniel spoke softly, just loud enough for the two men beside him. "I used to think saving someone meant carrying them out of the fire," he said. "Turns out, sometimes it means letting them carry you afterward." Michael smiled, eyes shining. "And I thought being saved was about breathing again." He answered, "But it was really about learning. I was worth saving." Alexander said nothing at first. He reached into his coat and pulled out 3 small bronze coins, each stamped with a simple cross. He pressed one into Daniel's palm, one into Michael's, and kept the last for himself. "I had these made," he finally said, voice low. "Every time I'm tempted to believe money fixes everything, I touch this and remember the day I had nothing to offer but a prayer on my knees in the dirt. That was the richest I've ever been." The ceremony ended with the ringing of the old bell, 3 sets of 5, the traditional signal for a firefighter returning home. As the crowd began to drift toward the tables of food, a little girl with dark curls broke free from the families and ran straight to Daniel. "Daddy," she called, wrapping her arms around his legs. Daniel lifted her high, kissing her cheek. Michael watched them, then looked at Alexander. "You know," he said, "I never had children, but now I've got a niece who calls me Uncle Mike and begs for piggyback rides I am still too slow to give." Alexander laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. Later, When the sky had gone purple and strings of lights glowed above the station yard, the three men sat on the tailgate of Daniel's truck, sharing coffee from the same thermos. Michael raised his cup. "To the day none of us will ever forget," he said. "To the smoke that brought us together," Daniel added. "And to the prayer that kept us there," Alexander finished. They clinked paper cups like fine crystal. People still talk about that fire in the city. They talk about the brave firefighter who ran in without hesitation. They talk about the CEO who knelt in a $1,000 suit and prayed like a child. And sometimes, if they listen closely at the diner, Michael now helps run with Daniel's wife. They hear the quiet janitor tell new customers that no one is ever just a stranger not when God decides to weave three broken lives into one unbreakable story. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world. Share this story if it touched your heart.